Apart from life, a strong constitution, and an abiding connection to the Thembu royal house, the only thing my father bestowed upon me at birth was a name, Rolihilala. In Xhosa, Rolihilala literally means, pulling the branch of a tree, but its colloquial meaning more accurately would be troublemaker. I do not believe that names are destiny or that my father somehow divined my future, but in later years, friends and relatives would ascribe to my birth name the many storms I have both caused and weathered. My more familiar English or Christian name was not given to me until my first day of school. But I am getting ahead of myself. I was born on the 18th of July, 1918, at Mezo, a tiny village on the banks of the Mbashi River in the district of Umtata, the capital of The Transkei. The year of my birth marked the end of the Great War, the outbreak of an influenza epidemic that killed millions throughout the world, and the visit of a delegation of the African National Congress to the Versailles Peace Conference to voice the grievances of the African people of South Africa. Mezo, however, was a place apart, a tiny precinct removed from the world of great events, where life was lived much as it had been for hundreds of years. The Transkei is 800 miles east of Cape Town, 550 miles south of Johannesburg, and lies between the Kei River and The Natal border, between the rugged Drakensberg Mountains to the north and the blue waters of the Indian Ocean to the east. It is a beautiful country of rolling hills, fertile valleys, and 1,000 rivers and streams, which keep the landscape green even in winter. The Transkei used to be one of the largest territorial divisions within South Africa, covering an area the size of Switzerland, with a population of about 3.5 million Xhosas, and a tiny minority of Basothos and whites. It is home to the Thembu people, who are part of the Xhosa nation, of which I am a member. My father, Gadla Henry Mafakaniswa, was a chief by both blood and custom. He was confirmed as chief of Mezo by the king of the Thembu tribe, but under British rule, his selection had to be ratified by the government, which in Mezo took the form of the local magistrate. As a government-appointed chief, he was eligible for a stipend as well as a portion of the fees the government levied on the community for vaccination of livestock and communal grazing land. Although the role of chief was a venerable and esteemed one, it had, even 75 years ago, become debased by the control of an unsympathetic white government. The Thembu tribe reaches back for 20 generations to King Swide. According to tradition, the Thembu people lived in the foothills of The Drakensberg Mountains and migrated toward the coast in the 16th century, where they were incorporated into the Xhosa nation. The Xhosa are part of the Nguni people who have lived, hunted, and fished in the rich and temperate southeastern region of South Africa, between the Great Anterior Plateau to the north and the Indian Ocean to the south, since at least the 11th century. The Nguni can be divided into a northern group, the Zulu and the Swazi people, and a southern group, which is made up of Amabaka, Amabomyana, Amakaleka, Amamfangu, Amampodomus, Amampondo, Abasotho, and Abethembu, and together they comprise the Xhosa nation. The Xhosa are a proud and patrilineal people with an expressive and euphonious language and an abiding belief in the importance of laws, education, and courtesy. Xhosa society was a balanced and harmonious social order in which every individual knew his or her place. Each Xhosa belongs to a clan that traces its descent back to a specific forefather. I am a member of The Madiba clan, named after a Thembu chief who ruled in the Transkei in the 18th century. I am often addressed as Madiba, my clan name, a term of respect. Nubenkyuka, one of the greatest monarchs, who united the Thembu tribe, died in 1832. As was the custom, he had wives from the principal royal houses, the Great House, from which the heir is selected, the right-hand house, and the Igziba, a minor house that is referred to by some as the left-hand house. It was the task of the sons of the Igziba or left-hand house to settle royal disputes. Mtikrikra, the eldest son of the Great House, succeeded Nubenkyuka, and amongst his sons were Engangeliswe and Matanzima. Sabata, who ruled the Thembu from 1954, was the grandson of Engangeliswe and a senior to Kulza Dalivonga, better known as K.D. Matanzima, the former chief minister of the Transkei, my nephew, by law and custom, who was a descendant of Matanzima. The eldest son of the Igziba house was Simikade, whose younger brother was Mandela, my grandfather. Although over the decades there have been many stories that I was in the line of succession to the Thembu throne, the simple genealogy I have just outlined exposes those tales as a myth. Although I was a member of the royal household, I was not among the privileged few who were trained for rule. Instead, as a descendant of the Ixiba house, I was groomed, like my father before me, to counsel the rulers of the tribe. My father was a tall, dark-skinned man with a straight and stately posture, which I like to think I inherited. He had a tuft of white hair just above his forehead, and as a boy, I would take white ash and rub it into my hair in imitation of him. My father had a stern manner and did not spare the rod. When disciplining his children, he could be exceedingly stubborn, another trait that may unfortunately have been passed down from father to son. My father has sometimes been referred to as the Prime Minister of Thembuland during the reigns of Delaindaibo, the father of Sabata, who ruled in the early 1900s, and that of his son, John Intaba, who succeeded him. That is a misnomer in that no such title existed, but the role he played was not so different from what the designation implies. As a respected and valued counselor to both kings, he accompanied them on their travels and was usually to be found by their sides during important meetings with government officials. He was an acknowledged custodian of Xhosa history, and it was partially for that reason that he was valued as an advisor. My own interest in history had early roots and was encouraged by my father. Although my father could neither read nor write, he was reputed to be an excellent orator who captivated his audiences by entertaining them as well as teaching them. In later years, I discovered that my father was not only an advisor to kings but a kingmaker. After the untimely death of John Elizwe in the 1920s, his son Sabata, the infant of the Great Wife, was too young to ascend to the throne. A dispute arose as to which of Delaindaibo's three most senior sons from other mothers, John Intaba, Dabulimanzi, and Melithafa, should be selected to succeed him. My father was consulted and recommended John Intaba on the grounds that he was the best educated. John Intaba, he argued, would not only be a fine custodian of the crown, but an excellent mentor to the young prince. My father, and a few other influential chiefs, had the great respect for education that is often present in those who are uneducated. The recommendation was controversial, for John Intaba's mother was from a lesser house, but my father's choice was ultimately accepted by both the Thembus and the British government. In time, John Intaba would return the favor in a way that my father could not then imagine. All told, my father had 4 wives, the third of whom, my mother, Nosekeni Fanny, the daughter of Nkedama from the Amampemvu clan of The Xhosa, belonged to the right-hand house. Each of these wives, the great wife, the right-hand wife, my mother, the left-hand wife, and The wife of the Ikadi or support house, had her own kraal. A kraal was a homestead and usually included a simple fenced-in enclosure for animals, fields for growing crops, and 1 or more thatched huts. The kraals of my father's wives were separated by many miles and he commuted among them. In these travels, my father sired 13 children in all, 4 boys and 9 girls. I am the eldest child of the right-hand house, and The youngest of my father's 4 sons. I have 3 sisters, Baliwe, who was the oldest girl, Notanku, and Makhutswana. Although the eldest of my father's sons was Malwa, my father's heir as chief was Delaichili, the son of the great house, who died in the early 1930s. All of his sons, with The exception of myself, are now deceased, and each was my senior not only in age but in status. When I was not much more than a newborn child, my father was involved in a dispute that deprived him of his chieftainship at Mezo and revealed a strain in his character I believe he passed on to his son. I maintain that nurture, rather than nature, is the primary molder of personality, but my father possessed a proud rebelliousness, a stubborn sense of fairness, that I recognize in myself. As a chief, or headman, as it was often known among the whites, my father was compelled to account for his stewardship not only to the Thembu king but to the local magistrate. One day one of my father's subjects lodged a complaint against him involving an ox that had strayed from its owner. The magistrate accordingly sent a message, ordering my father to appear before him. When my father received the summons, He sent back the following reply, Andisi, endisicula, I will not. Come, I am still girding for battle. One did not defy magistrates in those days. Such behavior would be regarded as the height of insolence, and in this case it was. My father's response bespoke his belief that the magistrate had no legitimate power over him. When it came to tribal matters, he was guided not by the laws of the King of England, but by Thembu custom. This defiance was not a fit of pique, but a matter of principle. He was asserting his traditional prerogative as a chief and was challenging the authority of the magistrate. When the magistrate received my father's response, he promptly charged him with insubordination. There was no inquiry or investigation that was reserved for white civil servants. The magistrate simply deposed my father, thus ending the Mandela family chieftainship. He was unaware of these events at the time, but he was not unaffected. My father, who was a wealthy nobleman by the standards of his time, lost both his fortune and his title. He was deprived of most of his herd and land, and the revenue that came with them. Because of our straitened circumstances, my mother moved to Kunu, a slightly larger village north of Mezo, where she would have the support of friends and relations. We lived in a less grand style in Kunu, but it was in that village near Umtata that I spent the happiest years of my boyhood and whence I trace my earliest memories. The village of Kunu was situated in a narrow, grassy valley crisscrossed by clear streams, and overlooked by green hills. It consisted of no more than a few hundred people who lived in huts, which were beehive-shaped structures of mud walls, with a wooden pole in the center holding up a peaked, grass roof. The floor was made of crushed ant heap, the hard dome of excavated earth. Above an ant colony, and was kept smooth by smearing it regularly with fresh cow dung. The smoke from the hearth escaped through the roof, and the only opening was a low doorway one had to stoop to walk through. The huts were generally grouped together in a residential area that was some distance away from the maize fields. There were no roads, only paths through the grass worn away by barefooted boys and women. The women and children of the village wore blankets dyed in ochre. Only the few Christians in the village wore Western-style clothing. Cattle, sheep, goats, and horses grazed together in common pastures. The land around Kunu was mostly treeless except for a cluster of poplars on a hill overlooking the village. The land itself was owned by the state. With very few exceptions, Africans at the time did not enjoy private title to land in South Africa but were tenants paying rent annually to the government. In the area, there were 2 small primary schools, a general store, and a dipping tank to rid the cattle of ticks and diseases. Maize, what we called mealies and people in the West call corn, sorghum, beans, and pumpkins formed the largest portion of our diet, not because of any inherent preference for these foods, but because the people could not afford anything richer. The wealthier families in our village supplemented their diets with tea, coffee, and sugar, but for most people in Kunu these were exotic luxuries far beyond their means. The water used for farming, cooking, and washing had to be fetched in buckets from streams and springs. This was women's work, and indeed, Kunu was a village of women and children. Most of the men spent the greater part of the year working on remote farms or in the mines along the reef, the great ridge of gold-bearing rock and shale that forms the southern boundary of Johannesburg. They returned perhaps twice a year, mainly to plow their fields. The hoeing, weeding, and harvesting were left to the women and children. Few if any of the people in the village knew how to read or write. And the concept of education was still a foreign one to many. My mother presided over 3 huts at Kunu which, as I remember, were always filled with the babies and children of my relations. In fact, I hardly recall any occasion as a child when I was alone. In African culture, the sons and daughters of one's aunts or uncles are considered brothers and sisters, not cousins. We do not make the same distinctions among relations practiced by whites. We have no half-brothers or half-sisters. My mother's sister is my mother, my uncle's son is my brother's child is my son, my daughter. Of my mother's 3 huts, one was used for cooking, one for sleeping, and one for storage. In the hut in which we slept, there was no furniture in the Western sense. We slept on mats and sat on the ground. I did not discover pillows until I went to Makhekesweni. My mother cooked food in a three-legged iron pot over an open fire in the center of the hut or outside. Everything we ate we grew and made ourselves. My mother planted and harvested her own mealies. Mealies were harvested from the field when they were hard and dry. They were stored in sacks or pits dug in the ground. When preparing the mealies, the women used different methods. They could grind the kernels between two stones to make bread, or boil the mealies first, producing mfotulo, mealie flour eaten with sour milk, or umenkusho, samp, sometimes plain or mixed with beans. Unlike mealies, which were sometimes in short supply, milk from our cows and goats was always plentiful. From an early age, I spent most of my free time in the veld playing and fighting with the other boys of the village. A boy who remained at home, tied to his mother's apron strings, was regarded as a sissy. At night, I shared my food and blanket with these same boys. I was no more than 5 when I became a herd boy, looking after sheep and calves in the fields. I discovered the almost mystical attachment that the Xhosa have for cattle. Not only as a source of food and wealth, but as a blessing from God and a source of happiness. It was in the fields that I learned how to knock birds out of the sky with a slingshot, to gather wild honey and fruits and edible roots, to drink warm, sweet milk straight from the udder of a cow, to swim in the clear, cold streams, and to catch fish with twine and sharpened bits of wire. I learned to stick fight, essential knowledge to any rural African boy, and became adept at its various techniques, parrying blows, feinting in one direction and striking in another, breaking away from an opponent with quick footwork. From these days I date my love of the veld, of open spaces, the simple beauties of nature, the clean line of the horizon. As boys, we were mostly left to our own devices. We played with toys we made ourselves. We molded animals and birds out of clay. We made ox-drawn sleighs out of tree branches. Nature was our playground. The hills above Kunu were dotted with large smooth rocks which we transformed into our own roller coaster. We sat on flat stones and slid down the face of the large rocks. We did this until our backsides were so we could hardly sit down. I learned to ride by sitting atop weaned calves. After being thrown to the ground several times, one got the hang of it. I learned my lesson one day from an unruly donkey. We had been taking turns climbing up and down its back, and when my chance came I jumped on and the donkey bolted into a nearby thornbush. It bent its head, trying to unseat me, which it did, but not before the thorns had pricked and scratched my face, embarrassing me in front of my friends. Like the people of the East, Africans have a highly developed sense of dignity, or what the Chinese call face. I had lost face among my friends. Even though it was a donkey that unseated me, I learned that to humiliate another person is to make him suffer an unnecessarily cruel fate. Even as a boy, I defeated my opponents without dishonoring them. Usually the boys played among themselves, but we sometimes allowed our sisters to join us. Boys and girls would play games like Endice, Hide and Seek, and I Squaw, Touch and Run. But the game I most enjoyed playing with the girls was what we called Khetha, or Choose the One You Like. This was not so much an organized game, but a spur-of-the-moment sport that took place when we accosted a group of girls our own age and demanded that each select the boy she loved. Our rules dictated that the girl's choice be respected, and once she had chosen her favorite, she was free to continue on her journey escorted by the lucky boy she loved. But the girls were nimble-witted, far cleverer than we doltish lads, and would often confer among themselves and choose one boy, usually the plainest fellow, and then tease him all the way home. The most popular game for boys was Tinti, and like most boys' games it was a youthful approximation of war. 2 sticks, used as targets, would be driven firmly into the ground in an upright position about 100 feet apart. The goal of the game was for each team to hurl sticks at the opposing target and knock it down. We each defended our own target and attempted to prevent the other side from retrieving the sticks that had been thrown over. As we grew older, we organized matches against boys from neighboring villages, and those who distinguished themselves in these fraternal battles were greatly admired, as generals who achieve great victories in war are justly celebrated. After games such as these, I would return to my mother's kraal where she was preparing supper. Whereas my father once told stories of historic battles and heroic Xhosa warriors, my mother would enchant us with Xhosa legends and fables that had come down from numberless generations. These tales stimulated my childish imagination, and usually contained some moral lesson. I recall one story my mother told us about a traveler who was approached by an old woman with terrible cataracts on her eyes. The woman asked the traveler for help, and the man averted his eyes. Then, another man came along and was approached by the old woman. She asked him to clean her eyes, and even though he found the task unpleasant, he did as she asked. Then, miraculously, the scales fell from the old woman's eyes and she became young and beautiful. The man married her and became wealthy and prosperous. It is a simple tale, but its message is an enduring one. Virtue and generosity will be rewarded in ways that one cannot know. Like all Xhosa children, I acquired knowledge mainly through observation. We were meant to learn through imitation and emulation, not through questions. When I first visited the homes of whites, I was often dumbfounded by the number and nature of questions that children asked of their parents, and their parents' unfailing willingness to answer them. In my household, questions were considered a nuisance. Adults imparted information as they considered necessary. My life, and that of most Xhosas at the time, was shaped by custom, ritual, and taboo. This was the alpha and omega of our existence, and went unquestioned. Men followed the path laid out for them by their fathers. Women led the same lives as their mothers had before them. Without being told, I soon assimilated the elaborate rules that governed the relations between men and women. I discovered that a man may not enter a house where a woman has recently given birth, and that a newly married woman would not enter the kraal of her new home without elaborate ceremony. I also learned that to neglect one's ancestors would bring ill fortune and failure in life. If you dishonored your ancestors in some fashion, the only way to atone for that lapse was to consult with a traditional healer or tribal elder, who communicated with the ancestors and conveyed profound apologies. All of these beliefs seemed perfectly natural to me. I came across few whites as a boy at Kunu. The local magistrate, of course, was white, as was the nearest shopkeeper. Occasionally white travelers or policemen passed through our area. These whites appeared as grand as gods to me, and I was aware that they were to be treated with a mixture of fear and respect. But their role in my life was a distant one, and I thought little if at all about the white man in general or relations between my own people and these curious and remote figures. The only rivalry between different clans or tribes in our small world at Kunu was that between the Xhosas and the Amamfangu, a small number of whom lived in our village. Amamfangu arrived on the Eastern Cape after fleeing from Saka Zulu's armies in a period known as the Mfecane, The great wave of battles and migrations between 1820 and 1840 set in motion by the rise of Saka and the Zulu state, during which the Zulu warrior sought to conquer and then unite all the tribes under military rule. Amamfangu, who were not originally Xhosa speakers, were refugees from The Mfecane and were forced to do jobs that no other African would do. They worked on white farms and in white businesses, something that was looked down upon by the more established Xhosa tribes. But Amamfangu were an industrious people, and because of their contact with Europeans, they were often more educated and Western than other Africans. When I was a boy, Amamfangu were the most advanced section of the community and furnished our clergymen, policemen, teachers, clerks, and interpreters. They were also amongst the first to become Christians, to build better houses, and to use scientific methods of agriculture, and they were wealthier than their Xhosa compatriots. They confirmed the missionaries' axiom, that to be Christian was to be civilized, and to be civilized was to be Christian. There still existed some hostility toward Amamfangu, but in retrospect, I would attribute this more to jealousy than tribal animosity. This local form of tribalism that I observed as a boy was relatively harmless. At that stage, I did not witness nor even suspect the violent tribal rivalries that would subsequently be promoted by the white rulers of South Africa. My father did not subscribe to local prejudice toward Amamfangu and befriended two Amamfangu brothers, George and Ben Mbekela. The brothers were an exception in Kunu. They were educated and Christian. George, The older of the two was a retired teacher and Ben was a police sergeant. Despite the proselytizing of the Mbekela brothers, my father remained aloof from Christianity and instead reserved his own faith for the Great Spirit of the Xhosas, Kamata, the god of his fathers. My father was an unofficial priest and presided over ritual slaughtering of goats and calves and officiated at local traditional rites concerning planting, harvest, birth, marriage, initiation ceremonies, and funerals. He did not need to be ordained, for the traditional religion of the Xhosas is characterized by a cosmic wholeness, so that there is little distinction between the sacred and the secular, between the natural and the supernatural. While the faith of the Mbekela brothers did not rub off on my father, it did inspire my mother, who became a Christian. In fact, Fanny was literally her Christian name, for she had been given it in church. It was due to the influence of the Mbekela brothers that I myself was baptized into the Methodist, or Wesleyan church as it was then known, and sent to school. The brothers would often see me playing or minding sheep and come over to talk to me. One day, George Mbekela paid a visit to my mother. "Your son is a clever young fellow," he said. "He should go to school." My mother remained silent. No one in my family had ever attended school and my mother was unprepared for Mbekela's suggestion. But she did relay it to my father, who despite, or perhaps because of, his own lack of education immediately decided that his youngest son should go to school. The schoolhouse consisted of a single room, with a Western-style roof, on the other side of the hill from Kunu. I was 7 years old, and on the day before it was to begin, my father took me aside and told me that I must be dressed properly for school. Until that time, I, like all the other boys in Kunu, had worn only a blanket, which was wrapped around one shoulder and pinned at the waist. My father took a pair of his trousers and cut them at the knee. He told me to put them on, which I did, and they were roughly the correct length, although the waist was far too large. My father then took a piece of string and cinched the trousers at the waist. I must have been a comical sight, but I have never owned a suit I was prouder to wear than my father's cut-off pants. On the first day of school, my teacher, Miss Mdingane, gave each of us an English name and said that from thenceforth that was the name we would answer to in school. This was the custom among Africans in those days and was undoubtedly due to the British bias of our education. The education I received was a British education, in which British ideas, British culture, British institutions, were automatically assumed to be superior. There was no such thing as African culture. Africans of my generation, and even today, generally have both an English and an African name. Whites were either unable or unwilling to pronounce an African name, and considered it uncivilized to have one. That day, Miss Mdingane told me that my new name was Nelson. Why she bestowed this particular name upon me I have no idea. Perhaps it had something to do with the great British sea captain Lord Nelson, but that would be only a guess. One night, when I was 9 years old, I was aware of a commotion in the household. My father, who took turns visiting his wives and usually came to us for perhaps 1 week a month, had arrived. But it was not at his accustomed time, for he was not scheduled to be with us for another few days. I found him in my mother's hut, lying on his back on the floor, in the midst of what seemed like an endless fit of coughing. Even to my young eyes, it was clear that my father was not long for this world. He was ill with some type of lung disease, but it was not diagnosed, as my father had never visited a doctor. He remained in the hut for several days without moving or speaking, and then one night he took a turn for the worse. My mother and my father's youngest wife, Norimani, who had come to stay with us, were looking after him, and late that night he called for Norimani. "Bring me my tobacco," he told her. My mother and Norimani conferred, and decided that it was unwise that he have tobacco in his current state. But he persisted in calling for it, and eventually Norimani filled his pipe, lit it, and then handed it to him. My father smoked and became calm. He continued smoking for perhaps an hour, and then, his pipe still lit, he died. I do not remember experiencing great grief so much as feeling cut adrift. Although my mother was the center of my existence, I defined myself through my father. My father's passing changed my whole life in a way that I did not suspect at the time. After a brief period of mourning, my mother informed me that I would be leaving Kunu. I did not ask her why, or where I was going. I packed the few things that I possessed, and early one morning we set out on a journey westward to my new residence. I mourned less for my father than for the world I was leaving behind. Kunu was all that I knew, and I loved it in the unconditional way that a child loves his first home. Before we disappeared behind the hills, I turned and looked for what I imagined was the last time at my village. I could see the simple huts and the people going about their chores, the stream where I had splashed and played with the other boys, the maize fields and green pastures where the herds and flocks were lazily grazing. I imagined my friends out hunting for small birds, drinking the sweet milk from the cow's udder, cavorting in the pond at the end of the stream. Above all else, my eyes rested on the three simple huts where I had enjoyed my mother's love and protection. It was these three huts that I associated with all my happiness, with life itself, and I rued the fact that I had not kissed each of them before I left. I could not imagine that the future I was walking toward could compare in any way to the past that I was leaving behind. We traveled by foot and in silence until the sun was sinking slowly toward the horizon. But the silence of the heart between mother and child is not a lonely one. My mother and I never talked very much, but we did not need to. I never doubted her love or questioned her support. It was an exhausting journey, along rocky dirt roads, up and down hills, past numerous villages, but we did not pause. Late in the afternoon, at the bottom of a shallow valley surrounded by trees, we came upon a village at the center of which was a large and gracious home that so far exceeded anything that I had ever seen that all I could do was marvel at it. The buildings consisted of 2 iingzande, rectangular houses, and 7 stately rondables. Superior huts, all washed in white lime, dazzling even in the light of the setting sun. There was a large front garden and a maize field bordered by rounded peach trees. An even more spacious garden spread out in back, which boasted apple trees, a vegetable garden, a strip of flowers, and a patch of wattles. Nearby was a white stucco church. In the shade of 2 gum trees that graced the doorway of the front of the main house sat a group of about 20 tribal elders. Encircling the property, contentedly grazing on the rich land, was a herd of at least 50 cattle and perhaps 500 sheep. Everything was beautifully tended, and it was a vision of wealth and order beyond my imagination. This was the great place, Makekezweni, the provisional capital of Thembuland, the royal residence of Chief John Ntaba Delaindaibo, acting regent of the Thembu people. As I contemplated all this grandeur, an enormous motorcar rumbled through the western gate and the men sitting in the shade immediately arose. They doffed their hats and then jumped to their feet shouting, "Bayat Aa, John Ntaba. Hail, John Ntaba," the traditional salute of the Xhosas for their chief. Out of the motorcar, I learned later that this majestic vehicle was a Ford version 8, stepped a short, thick-set man wearing a smart suit. I could see that he had the confidence and bearing of a man who was used to the exercise of authority. His name suited him, for John Ntaba literally means one who looks at the mountain, and he was a man with a sturdy presence toward whom all eyes gazed. He had a dark complexion and an intelligent face, and he casually shook hands with each of the men beneath the tree, men who as I later discovered comprised the highest Thembu court of justice. This was the regent who was to become my guardian and benefactor for the next decade. In that moment of beholding John Ntaba and his court, I felt like a sapling pulled root and branch from the earth and flung into the center of a stream whose strong current I could not resist. I felt a sense of awe mixed with bewilderment. Until then I had had no thoughts of anything but my own pleasures, no higher ambition than to eat well and become a champion stick fighter. I had no thought of money, or class, or fame, or power. Suddenly a new world opened before me. Children from poor homes often find themselves beguiled by a host of new temptations when suddenly confronted by great wealth. I was no exception. I felt many of my established beliefs and loyalties begin to ebb away. The slender foundation built by my parents began to shake. In that instant, I saw that life might hold more for me than being a champion stick fighter. I learned later that, in the wake of my father's death, John Ntaba had offered to become my guardian. He would treat me as he treated his other children, And I would have the same advantages as they. My mother had no choice, one did not turn down such an overture from the regent. She was satisfied that although she would miss me, I would have a more advantageous upbringing in the regent's care than in her own. The regent had not forgotten that it was due to my father's intervention that he had become acting paramount chief. My mother remained in Makhekezweni for a day or two before returning to Kunu. Our parting was without fuss. She offered no sermons, no words of wisdom, no kisses. I suspect she did not want me to feel bereft at her departure, and so was matter of fact. I knew that my father had wanted me to be educated and prepared for a wide world, and I could not do that in Kunu. Her tender look was all the affection and support I needed, and as she departed she turned to me and said, "Ukanisu fokoto, kwedini." Brace yourself, my boy. Children are often the least sentimental of creatures, especially if they are absorbed in some new pleasure. Even as my dear mother and first friend was leaving, my head was swimming with the delights of my new home. How could I not be braced up? I was already wearing the handsome new outfit purchased for me by my guardian. I was quickly caught up in the daily life of Makhekezweni. A child adapts rapidly, or not at all, and I had taken to the great place as though I had been raised there. To me, it was a magical kingdom. Everything was delightful. The chores that were tedious in Kunu became an adventure in Makhekezweni. When I was not in school, I was a plowboy, a wagon guide, a shepherd. I rode horses and shot birds with slingshots and found boys to joust with, and some nights I danced the evening away to the beautiful singing and clapping of Thembu maidens. Although I missed Kunu and my mother, I was completely absorbed in my new world. I attended a one-room school next door to the palace and studied English, Xhosa, history, and geography. We read Chambers' English Reader and did our lessons on black slates. Our teachers, Mr. Fadana, and later, Mr. Gikwa, took a special interest in me. I did well in school, not so much through cleverness as through doggedness. My own self-discipline was reinforced by my Aunt Fatiwe, who lived in the great place and scrutinized my homework every night. Makhekezweni was a mission station of the Methodist Church and far more up-to-date and westernized than Kunu. People dressed in modern clothes. The men wore suits and the women affected the severe Protestant style of the missionaries, thick long skirts and high-necked blouses, with a blanket draped over the shoulder and a scarf wound elegantly around the head. If the world of Makhekezweni revolved around the regent, my smaller world revolved around his two children. Justice, the elder, was his only son and heir to the great place, and Nomafu was the regent's daughter. I lived with them and was treated exactly as they were. We ate the same food, wore the same clothes, performed the same chores. We were later joined by Ensako, the older brother to Sabata, the heir to the throne. The four of us formed a royal quartet. The regent and his wife New England brought me up as if I were their own child. They worried about me, guided me, and punished me, all in a spirit of loving fairness. John Intaba was stern, but I never doubted his love. They called me by the pet name of Tatumhulu, which means grandpa, because they said when I was very serious, I looked like an old man. Justice was 4 years older than I and became my first hero after my father. I looked up to him in every way. He was already at Clarkberry, a boarding school about 60 miles distant. Tall, handsome, and muscular, he was a fine sportsman, excelling in track and field, cricket, rugby, and soccer. Cheerful and outgoing, he was a natural performer who enchanted audiences with his singing and transfixed them with his ballroom dancing. He had a bevy of female admirers, but also a coterie of critics, who considered him a dandy and a playboy. Justice and I became the best of friends, though we were opposites in many ways. He was extroverted, I was introverted, he was light-hearted, I was serious. Things came easily to him, I had to drill myself. To me, he was everything a young man should be and everything I longed to be. Though we were treated alike, our destinies were different. Justice would inherit one of the most powerful chieftainships of the Thembu tribe, while I would inherit whatever the regent, in his generosity, decided to give me. Every day I was in and out of the regent's house doing errands. Of the chores I did for the regent, the one I enjoyed most was pressing his suits, a job in which I took great pride. He owned half a dozen Western suits, and I spent many an hour carefully making the crease in his trousers. His palace, as it were, consisted of two large Western-style houses with tin roofs. In those days, very few Africans had Western houses and they were considered a mark of great wealth. 6 rondables stood in a semicircle around the main house. They had wooden floorboards, something I had never seen before. The regent and the queen slept in the right-hand rondavelle, the queen's sister in the center one, and the left-hand hut served as a pantry. Under the floor of the queen's sister's hut was a beehive, and we would sometimes take up a floorboard or two and feast on its honey. Shortly after I moved to Makhekezweni, the regent and his wife moved to the Exende, middle house, which automatically became the Great House. There were 3 small rondables near it, one for the regent's mother, one for visitors, and one shared by Justice and myself. The 2 principles that governed my life at Makhekezweni were chieftaincy and the church. These 2 doctrines existed in uneasy harmony, although I did not then see them as antagonistic. For me, Christianity was not so much a system of beliefs as it was the powerful creed of a single man, Reverend Matiolo. For me, his powerful presence embodied all that was alluring in Christianity. He was as popular and beloved as the regent, and the fact that he was the regent's superior in spiritual matters made a strong impression on me. But the church was as concerned with this world as the next. I saw that virtually all of the achievements of Africans seemed to have come about through the missionary work of the church. The mission schools trained the clerks, the interpreters, and the policemen, who at the time represented the height of African aspirations. Reverend Matiolo was a stout man in his mid-50s, with a deep and potent voice that lent itself to both preaching and singing. When he preached at the simple church at the western end of Makhekezweni, the hall was always brimming with people. The hall rang with the hosannas of the faithful, while the women knelt at his feet to beg for salvation. The first tale I heard about him when I arrived at the great place was that the Reverend had chased away a dangerous ghost with only a Bible and a lantern as weapons. I saw neither implausibility nor contradiction in the story. The Methodism preached by Reverend Matiolo was of the fire and brimstone variety, seasoned with a bit of African animism. The Lord was wise and omnipotent, but he was also a vengeful God who let no bad deed go unpunished. At Kunu, the only time I had ever attended church was on the day that I was baptized. Religion was a ritual that I indulged in for my mother's sake, and to which I attached no meaning. But at Makhekezweni, religion was a part of the fabric of life, and I attended church each Sunday along with the regent and his wife. The regent took his religion very seriously. In fact, the only time that I was ever given a hiding by him was when I dodged a Sunday service to take part in a fight against boys from another village, a transgression I never committed again. That was not the only rebuke received on account of my trespasses against the Reverend. One afternoon, I crept into Reverend Matiolo's garden and stole some maize, which I roasted and ate right there. A young girl saw me eating the corn in the garden and immediately reported my presence to the priest. The news quickly made the rounds and reached the regent's wife. That evening, she waited until prayer time, which was a daily ritual in the house, and confronted me with my misdeed, reproaching me for taking the bread from a poor servant of God and disgracing the family. She said the devil would certainly take me to task for my sin. I felt an unpleasant mixture of fear and shame, fear that I would get some cosmic comeuppance and shame that I had abused the trust of my adopted family. Because of the universal respect the regent enjoyed, from both black and white, and the seemingly untempered power that he wielded, I saw chieftaincy as being the very center around which life revolved. The power and influence of chieftaincy pervaded every aspect of our lives in Makhekezweni and was the preeminent means through which one could achieve influence and status. My later notions of leadership were profoundly influenced by observing the regent and his court. I watched and learned from the tribal meetings that were regularly held at the great place. These were not scheduled, but were called as needed, and were held to discuss national matters such as a drought, the culling of cattle, policies ordered by the magistrate, or new laws decreed by the government. All Thembus were free to come, and a great many did, on horseback or by foot. On these occasions, the regent was surrounded by his Amafakati, a group of councillors of high rank who functioned as the regent's parliament and judiciary. They were wise men who retained the knowledge of tribal history and custom in their heads and whose opinions carried great weight. Letters advising these chiefs and headmen of a meeting were dispatched from the regent, and soon the great place became alive with important visitors and travelers from all over Thembuland. The guests would gather in the courtyard in front of the regent's house and he would open the meeting by thanking everyone for coming and explaining why he had summoned them. From that point on, he would not utter another word until the meeting was nearing its end. Everyone who wanted to speak did so. It was democracy in its purest form. There may have been a hierarchy of importance among the speakers, but everyone was heard, chief and subject, warrior and medicine man, shopkeeper and farmer, landowner and laborer. People spoke without interruption and the meetings lasted for many hours. The foundation of self-government was that all men were free to voice their opinions and equal in their value as citizens. Women, I am afraid, were deemed second-class citizens. A great banquet was served during the day, and I often gave myself a bellyache by eating too much while listening to speaker after speaker. I noticed how some speakers rambled and never seemed to get to the point. I grasped how others came to the matter at hand directly, and who made a set of arguments succinctly and cogently. I observed how some speakers used emotion and dramatic language, and tried to move the audience with such techniques, while other speakers were sober and even, and shunned emotion. At first, I was astonished by the vehemence and candor with which people criticized the regent. He was not above criticism, in fact, he was often the principal target of it. But no matter how flagrant the charge, the regent simply listened, not defending himself, showing no emotion at all. The meetings would continue until some kind of consensus was reached. They ended in unanimity or not at all. Unanimity, however, might be an agreement to disagree, to wait for a more propitious time to propose a solution. Democracy meant all men were to be heard, and a decision was taken together as a people. Majority rule was a foreign notion. A minority was not to be crushed by a majority. Only at the end of the meeting, as the sun was setting, would the regent speak. His purpose was to sum up what had been said and form some consensus among the diverse opinions. But no conclusion was forced on people who disagreed. If no agreement could be reached, another meeting would be held. At the very end of the council, a praise singer or poet would deliver a panegyric to the ancient kings, and a mixture of compliments to and satire on the present chiefs, and the audience, led by the regent, would roar with laughter. As a leader, I have always followed the principles I first saw demonstrated by the regent at the great place. I have always endeavored to listen to what each and every person in a discussion had to say before venturing my own opinion. Oftentimes, my own opinion will simply represent a consensus of what I heard in the discussion. I always remember the regent's axiom: a leader, he said, is like a shepherd. He stays behind the flock, letting the most nimble go out ahead, whereupon the others follow, not realizing that all along they are being directed from behind. It was at Makhekezweni that I developed my interest in African history. Until then I had heard only of Xhosa heroes, but at the great place I learned of other African heroes like Shekukhune, king of the Bapedi, and the Basotho king, Moshushu, and Dingane, king of the Zulus, and others such as Bambatha, Hinsa and Makana, Mount Shiva and Kilegama. I learned of these men from the chiefs and headmen who came to the great place to settle disputes and try cases. Though not lawyers, these men presented cases and then adjudicate them. Some days, they would finish early and sit around telling stories. I hovered silently and listened. They spoke in an idiom that I'd never heard before. Their speech was formal and lofty, their manner slow and unhurried, and the traditional clicks of our language were long and dramatic. At first, they shooed me away and told me I was too young to listen. Later they would beckon me to fetch fire or water for them, or to tell the women they wanted tea, and in those early months I was too busy running errands to follow their conversation. But, eventually, they permitted me to stay, and I discovered the great African patriots who fought against Western domination. My imagination was fired by the glory of these African warriors. The most ancient of the chiefs who regaled the gathered elders with ancient tales was Zawelibhangile Joyi, a son from the great house of King Nubain Kuka. Chief Joyi was so old that his wrinkled skin hung on him like a loose-fitting coat. His stories unfolded slowly and were often punctuated by a great wheezing cough, which would force him to stop for minutes at a time. Chief Joyi was the great authority on the history of Thembus in large part because he had lived through so much of it. But as grizzled as Chief Joyi often seemed, the decades fell off him when he spoke of the young umpas, or warriors, in the army of King Ngangelizwe fighting the British. In pantomime, Chief Joyi would fling his spear and creep along the veldt as he narrated the victories and defeats. He spoke of Ngangelizwe's heroism, generosity, and humility. Not all of Chief Joyi's stories revolved around the Thembus. When he first spoke of non-Khoza warriors, I wondered why. I was like a boy who worships a local soccer hero and is not interested in a national soccer star with whom he has no connection. Only later was I moved by the broad sweep of African history, and the deeds of all African heroes regardless of tribe. Chief Joyi railed against the white man, who he believed had deliberately sundered the Khoza tribe, dividing brother from brother. The white man had told the Thembus that their true chief was the great white queen across the ocean and that they were her subjects. But the white queen brought nothing but misery and perfidy to the black people, and if she was a chief, she was an evil chief. Chief Joyi's war stories and his indictment of the British made me feel angry and cheated, as though I had already been robbed of my own birthright. Chief Joyi said that the African people lived in relative peace until the coming of the Abelungu, the white people, who arrived from across the sea with fire-breathing weapons. Once, he said, the Thembu, the Mapondo, the Khoza, and the Zulu were all children of one father, and lived as brothers. The white man shattered the Abantu, the fellowship, of the various tribes. The white man was hungry and greedy for land, and the black man shared the land with him as they shared the air and water. Land was not for man to possess. But the white man took the land as you might seize another man's horse. I did not yet know that the real history of our country was not to be found in standard British textbooks, which claimed South Africa began with the landing of Jan van Riebeeck at the Cape of Good Hope in 1652. It was from Chief Joyi that I began to discover that the history of the Bantu-speaking peoples began far to the north, in a country of lakes and green plains and valleys, and that slowly over the millennia we made our way down to the very tip of this great continent. However, I later discovered that Chief Joyi's account of African history, particularly after 1652, was not always so accurate. In Makhekheisweni, I felt not unlike the proverbial country boy who comes to the big city. Makhekheisweni was far more sophisticated than Kunu, whose residents were regarded as backward by the people of Makhekheisweni. The regent was loath to have me visit Kunu, thinking I would regress and fall into bad company back in my old village. When I did visit, I sensed that my mother had been briefed by the regent, for she would question me closely as to whom I was playing with. On many occasions, however, the regent would arrange for my mother and sisters to be brought to the great place. When I first arrived in Makhekheisweni, I was regarded by some of my peers as a yokel who was hopelessly unequipped to exist in the rarefied atmosphere of the great place. As young men will, I did my best to appear suave and sophisticated. In church one day, I had noticed a lovely young woman who was one of the daughters of the Reverend Matiolo. Her name was Winnie, and I asked her out and she accepted. She was keen on me, but her eldest sister, Nomampondo, regarded me as hopelessly backward. She told her sister that I was a barbarian who was not good enough for the daughter of Reverend Matiolo. To prove to her younger sister how uncivilized I was, she invited me to the rectory for lunch. I was still used to eating at home, where we did not use knife and fork. At the family table, this mischievous older sister handed me a plate that contained a single chicken wing. But the wing, instead of being soft and tender, was a bit tough, so the meat did not fall easily off the bone. I watched the others using their knives and forks with ease and slowly picked up mine. I observed the others for a few moments, and then attempted to carve my little wing. At first I just moved it around the plate, hoping that the flesh would fall from the bone. Then I tried in vain to pin the thing down, and cut it, but it eluded me, and in my frustration I was clanking my knife on the plate. I tried this repeatedly and then noticed that the older sister was smiling at me and looking knowingly at the younger sister as if to say, I told you so. I struggled and became wet with perspiration, but I did not want to admit defeat and pick the infernal thing up with my hands. I did not eat much chicken that day at luncheon. Afterward the older sister told the younger, you will waste your whole life if you fall in love with such a backward boy, but I am happy to say the young lady did not listen. She loved me, as backward as I was. Eventually, of course, we went different ways and drifted apart. She attended a different school, and qualified as a teacher. We corresponded for a few years and then I lost track of her, but by that time I had considerably improved my table etiquette. When I was 16, the regent decided that it was time that I became a man. In Xhosa tradition, this is achieved through one means only: circumcision. In my tradition, an uncircumcised male cannot be heir to his father's wealth, cannot marry or officiate in tribal rituals, and uncircumcised Xhosa man is a contradiction in terms, for he is not considered a man at all, but a boy. For the Xhosa people, circumcision represents the formal incorporation of males into society. It is not just a surgical procedure, but a lengthy and elaborate ritual in preparation for manhood. As a Xhosa, I count my years as a man from the date of my circumcision. The traditional ceremony of the circumcision school was arranged principally for justice. The rest of us, 26 in all, were there mainly to keep him company. Early in the new year, we journeyed to 2 grass huts in a secluded valley on the banks of the Mbashi River, known as Tireless, the traditional place of circumcision for Thembu kings. The huts were seclusion lodges, where we were to live isolated from society. It was a sacred time. I felt happy and fulfilled taking part in my people's customs and ready to make the transition from boyhood to manhood. We had moved to Tireless by the river a few days before the actual circumcision ceremony. These last few days of boyhood were spent with the other initiates, and I found the camaraderie enjoyable. The lodge was near the home of Banabakhe Blai, the wealthiest and most popular boy at the circumcision school. He was an engaging fellow, a champion stick fighter and a glamour boy, whose many girlfriends kept us all supplied with delicacies. Although he could neither read nor write, he was one of the most intelligent among us. He regaled us with stories of his trips to Johannesburg, a place none of us had ever been before. He so thrilled us with tales of the mines that he almost persuaded me that to be a miner was more alluring than to be a monarch. Miners had a mystique. To be a miner meant to be strong and daring, the ideal of manhood. Much later, I realized that it was the exaggerated tales of boys like Banabakhe that caused so many young men to run away to work in the mines of Johannesburg, where they often lost their health and their lives. In those days, working in the mines was almost as much of a rite of passage as circumcision school, a myth that helped the Minyaonas more than it helped my people. A custom of circumcision school is that one must perform a daring exploit before the ceremony. In days of old, this might have involved a cattle raid or even a battle, but in our time the deeds were more mischievous than martial. 2 nights before we moved to Tireless, we decided to steal a pig. In Makhekesweni there was a tribesman with an ornery old pig. To avoid making noise and alarming him, we arranged for the pig to do our work for us. We took handfuls of sediment from homemade African beer, which has a strong scent much favored by pigs, and placed it upwind of the pig. The pig was so aroused by the scent that he came out of the kraal, following a trail we had laid, gradually made his way to us, wheezing and snorting and eating the sediment. When he got near us, we captured the poor pig, slaughtered it, and then built a fire and ate roast pork underneath the stars. No piece of pork has ever tasted as good before or since. The night before the circumcision, there was a ceremony near our huts with singing and dancing. Women came from the nearby villages, and we danced to their singing and clapping. As the music became faster and louder, our dance turned more frenzied and we forgot for a moment what lay ahead. At dawn, when the stars were still in the sky, we began our preparations. We were escorted to the river to bathe in its cold waters, a ritual that signified our purification before the ceremony. The ceremony was at midday, and we were commanded to stand in a row in a clearing some distance from the river where a crowd of parents and relatives, including the regent, as well as a handful of chiefs and councillors, had gathered. We were clad only in our blankets, and as the ceremony began, with drums pounding, we were ordered to sit on a blanket on the ground with our legs spread out in front of us. I was tense and anxious, uncertain of how I would react when the critical moment came. Flinching or crying out was a sign of weakness and stigmatized one's manhood. I was determined not to disgrace myself, the group, or my guardian. Circumcision is a trial of bravery and stoicism. No anesthetic is used. A man must suffer in silence. To the right, out of the corner of my eye, I could see a thin, elderly man emerge from a tent and kneel in front of the first boy. There was excitement in the crowd, and I shuddered slightly knowing that the ritual was about to begin. The old man was a famous Ingsibi, a circumcision expert, from Kalekaland, who would use his assegai to change us from boys to men with a single blow. Suddenly, I heard the first boy cry out, "Ndiindoda. I am a man," which we were trained to say in the moment of circumcision. Seconds later, I heard Justice's strangled voice pronounce the same phrase. There were now 2 boys before the Ingsibi reached me, and my mind must have gone blank because before I knew it, the old man was kneeling in front of me. I looked directly into his eyes. He was pale, and though the day was cold, his face was shining with perspiration. His hands moved so fast they seemed to be controlled by an otherworldly force. Without a word, he took my foreskin, pulled it forward, and then, in a single motion, brought down his assegai. I felt as if fire was shooting through my veins. The pain was so intense that I buried my chin into my chest. Many seconds seemed to pass before I remembered the cry, and then I recovered and called out, "Ndiindoda." I looked down and saw a perfect cut, clean and round like a ring. But I felt ashamed because the other boys seemed much stronger and braver than I had been. They had called out more promptly than I had. I was distressed that I had been disabled, however briefly, by the pain, and I did my best to hide my agony. A boy may cry, a man conceals his pain. I had now taken the essential step in the life of every Xhosa man. Now, I might marry, set up my own home, and plow my own field. I could now be admitted to the councils of the community. My words would be taken seriously. At the ceremony, I was given my circumcision name, Dilibyunga, meaning, founder of the Banga, the traditional ruling body of the Transkei. To Xhosa traditionalists, this name is more acceptable than either of my 2 previous given names, Rolihlala or Nelson, and I was proud to hear my new name pronounced, Dilibyunga. Immediately after the blow had been delivered, an assistant who follows the circumcision master takes the foreskin that is on the ground and ties it to a corner of your blanket. Our wounds were then dressed with a healing plant, the leaves of which were thorny on the outside but smooth on the inside, which absorbed the blood and other secretions. At the conclusion of the ceremony, we returned to our huts, where a fire was burning with wet wood that cast off clouds of smoke, which was thought to promote healing. We were ordered to lie on our backs in the smoky huts, with one leg flat, and one leg bent. We were now abakweta, initiates into the world of manhood. We were looked after by an Amakhankatha, or guardian, who explained the rules we must follow if we were to enter manhood properly. The first chore of the Amakhankatha was to paint our naked and shaved bodies from head to foot in white ochre, turning us into ghosts. The white chalk symbolized our purity, and I still recall how stiff the dried clay felt on my body. That first night, at midnight, an attendant, or Ikhankatha, crept around the hut, gently waking each of us. We were then instructed to leave the hut and go tramping through the night to bury our foreskins. The traditional reason for this practice was so that our foreskins would be hidden before wizards could use them for evil purposes, but, symbolically, we were also burying our youth. I did not want to leave the warm hut and wander through the bush in the darkness, but I walked into the trees and, after a few minutes, untied my foreskin and buried it in the earth. I felt as though I had now discarded the last remnant of my childhood. We lived in our 2 huts, 13 in each, while our wounds healed. When outside the huts, we were covered in blankets, for we were not allowed to be seen by women. It was a period of quietude, a kind of spiritual preparation for the trials of manhood that lay ahead. On the day of our re-emergence, we went down to the river early in the morning to wash away the white ochre in the waters of the Mbashi. Once we were clean and dry, we were coated in red ochre. The tradition was that one should sleep with a woman, who later may become one's wife, and she rubs off the pigment with her body. In my case, however, the ochre was removed with a mixture of fat and lard. At the end of our seclusion, the lodges and all their contents were burned, destroying our last links to childhood, and a great ceremony was held to welcome us as men to society. Our families, friends, and local chiefs gathered for speeches, songs, and gift-giving. I was given 2 heifers and 4 sheep, and felt far richer than I ever had before. I, who had never owned anything, suddenly possessed property. It was a heady feeling, even though my gifts were paltry next to those of Justice, who inherited an entire herd. I was not jealous of Justice's gifts. He was the son of a king. I was merely destined to be a counselor to a king. I felt strong and proud that day. I remember walking differently on that day, straighter, taller, firmer. I was hopeful, and thinking that I might someday have wealth, property, and status. The main speaker of the day was Chief Melikchili, the son of Deline Daibo, and after listening to him, my gaily colored dreams suddenly darkened. He began conventionally, remarking on how fine it was that we were continuing a tradition that had been going on for as long as anyone could remember. Then he turned to us and his tone suddenly changed. There sit our sons, he said, young, healthy, and handsome, the flower of the Xhosa tribe, the pride of our nation. We have just circumcised them in a ritual that promises them manhood, but I am here to tell you that it is an empty, illusory promise, a promise that can never be fulfilled. For we Xhosas, and all black South Africans, are a conquered people. We are slaves in our own country. We are tenants on our own soil. We have no strength, no power, no control over our own destiny in the land of our birth. They will go to cities where they will live in shacks and drink cheap alcohol, all because we have no land to give them where they could prosper and multiply. They will cough their lungs out deep in the bowels of the white man's mines, destroying their health, never seeing the sun, so that the white man can live a life of unequaled prosperity. Among these young men are chiefs who will never rule because we have no power to govern ourselves, soldiers who will never fight for we have no weapons to fight with, scholars who will never teach because we have no place for them to study. The abilities, the intelligence, the promise of these young men will be squandered in their attempt to eke out a living doing the simplest, most mindless chores for the white man. These gifts today are not, for we cannot give them the greatest gift of all, which is freedom and independence. I well know that Kamata is all-seeing and never sleeps, but I have a suspicion that Kamata may in fact be dozing. If this is the case, the sooner I die the better. Because then I can meet him and shake him awake and tell him that the children of Nubenkyuka, the flower of the Xhosa nation, are dying. The audience had become more and more quiet as Chief Melikchili spoke and, I think, more and more angry. No one wanted to hear the words that he spoke that day. I know that I myself did not want to hear them. I was cross rather than aroused by the chief's remarks, dismissing his words as the abusive comments of an ignorant man who was unable to appreciate the value of the education and benefits that the white man had brought to our country. At the time, I looked on the white man not as an oppressor but as a benefactor, and I thought the chief was enormously ungrateful. This upstart chief was ruining my day, spoiling the proud feeling with wrong-headed remarks. But without exactly understanding why, his words soon began to work in me. He had planted a seed, and though I let that seed lie dormant for a long season, it eventually began to grow. Later, I realized that the ignorant man that day was not the chief but myself. After the ceremony, I walked back to the river and watched it meander on its way to where, many miles distant, it emptied into the Indian Ocean. I had never crossed that river, and I knew little or nothing of the world beyond it, a world that beckoned me that day. It was almost sunset and I hurried on to where our seclusion lodges had been. Though it was forbidden to look back while the lodges were burning, I could not resist. When I reached The area, all that remained were two pyramids of ashes by a large mimosa tree. In these ash heaps lay a lost and delightful world, the world of my childhood, the world of sweet and irresponsible days at Kunu and Makhekezweni. Now I was a man, and I would never again play thinty, or steal maize, or drink milk from a cow's udder. I was already in mourning for my own youth. Looking back, I know that I was not a man that day and would not truly become one for many years. Unlike most of the others with whom I had been at circumcision school, I was not destined to work in the gold mines on the reef. The regent had often told me, "It is not for you to spend your life mining the white man's gold, never knowing how to write your name." My destiny was to become a counselor to Sabata, and for that I had to be educated. I returned to Makhekezweni after the ceremony, but not for very long, for I was about to cross the Mbashi River for the first time on my way to Clarkberry Boarding Institute in the district of Enkobo. I was again leaving home, but I was eager to see how I would fare in the wider world. The regent himself drove me to Enkobo in his majestic Ford version 8. Before leaving, he had organized a celebration for my having passed Standard V and been admitted to Clarkberry. A sheep was slaughtered and there was dancing and singing. It was the first celebration that I had ever had in my own honor, and I greatly enjoyed it. The regent gave me my first pair of boots, a sign of manhood, and that night I polished them anew, even though they were already shiny. Founded in 1825, Clarkberry Institute was located on the site of one of the oldest Wesleyan missions in the Transkei. At the time, Clarkberry was the highest institution of learning for Africans in Thembuland. The regent himself had attended Clarkberry, and justice had followed him there. It was both a secondary school and a teacher training college, but it also offered courses in more practical disciplines, such as carpentry, tailoring, and tinsmithing. During the trip, the regent advised me on my behavior and my future. He urged me to behave in a way that brought only respect to Sabata and to himself, and I assured him that I would. He then briefed me on the Reverend C. Harris, the governor of the school. Reverend Harris, he explained, was unique. He was a white Thembu, a white man who in his heart loved and understood the Thembu people. The regent said when Sabata was older, he would entrust the future king to Reverend Harris, who would train him as both a Christian and a traditional ruler. He said that I must learn from Reverend Harris because I was destined to guide the leader that Reverend Harris was to mold. At Makhekezweni I had met many white traders and government officials, including magistrates and police officers. These were men of high standing and the regent received them courteously, but not obsequiously. He treated them on equal terms, as they did him. At times, I even saw him upbraid them, though this was extremely rare. I had very little experience in dealing directly with whites. The regent never told me how to behave, and I observed him and followed his example. In talking about Reverend Harris, however, the regent, for the first time, gave me a lecture on how I was to conduct myself. He said I must afford the Reverend the same respect and obedience that I gave to him. Clarkberry was far grander even than Makhekezweni. The school itself consisted of a cluster of 24 or so graceful, colonial-style buildings, which included individual homes as well as dormitories, the library, and various instructional halls. It was the first place I'd lived that was Western, not African, and I felt I was entering a new world whose rules were not yet clear to me. We were taken into Reverend Harris's study, where the regent introduced me and I stood to shake his hand, the first time I had ever shaken hands with a white man. Reverend Harris was warm and friendly, and treated the regent with great deference. The regent explained that I was being groomed to be a counselor to the king and that he hoped the Reverend would take a special interest in me. The Reverend nodded, adding that Clarkberry students were required to do manual labor after school hours, and he would arrange for me to work in his garden. At the end of the interview, the regent bade me goodbye and handed me a pound note for pocket money, the largest amount of money I had ever possessed. I bade him farewell and promised that I would not disappoint him. Clarkberry was a Thembu college, founded on land given by the great Thembu king Nubenkyuka. As a descendant of Nubenkyuka, I presumed that I would be accorded the same deference at Clarkberry that I had come to expect in Makhekezweni. But I was painfully mistaken, for I was treated no differently than everyone else. No one knew or even cared that I was a descendant of the illustrious Nubenkuka. The boarding master received me without a blowing of trumpets, and my fellow students did not bow and scrape before me. At Clarkberry, plenty of the boys had distinguished lineages, and I was no longer unique. This was an important lesson, for I suspect I was a bit stuck up in those days. I quickly realized that I had to make my way on the basis of my ability, not my heritage. Most of my classmates could outrun me on the playing field and outthink me in the classroom, and I had a good deal of catching up to do. Classes commenced the following morning, and along with my fellow students I climbed the steps to the first floor where the classrooms were located. The room itself had a beautifully polished wooden floor. On this first day of classes I was clad in my new boots. I had never worn boots before of any kind, and that first day, I walked like a newly shod horse. I made a terrible racket walking up the steps and almost slipped several times. As I clomped into the classroom, my boots crashing on that shiny wooden floor, I noticed two female students in the first row were watching my lame performance with great amusement. The prettier of the two leaned over to her friend and said loud enough for all to hear, "The country boy is not used to wearing shoes," at which her friend laughed. I was blind with fury and embarrassment. Her name was Mathona and she was a bit of a smart aleck. That day I vowed never to talk to her. But as my mortification wore off, and I became more adept at walking with boots, I also got to know her, and she was to become my greatest friend at Clarkberry. She was my first true female friend, a woman I met on equal terms with whom I could confide and share secrets. In many ways, she was the model for all my subsequent friendships with women, for with women I found I could let my hair down and confess to weaknesses and fears I would never reveal to another man. I soon adapted myself to the life at Clarkberry. I participated in sports and games as often as I could, but my performances were no more than mediocre. I played for the love of sport, not the glory, for I received none. We played lawn tennis with homemade wooden rackets and soccer with bare feet on a field of dust. For the first time, I was taught by teachers who had themselves been properly educated. Several of them held university degrees, which was extremely rare. One day, I was studying with Mathona, and I confided to her my fear that I might not pass my exams in English and history at the end of the year. She told me not to worry because our teacher, Gertrude Entlabati, was the first African woman to obtain a BA. She is too clever to let us fail, Mathona said. I had not yet learned to feign knowledge that I did not possess, and as I had only a vague idea what a BA was, I questioned Mathona. "Oh, yes, of course," she answered. "A BA is a very long and difficult book." I did not doubt her. Another African teacher with a Bachelor of Arts degree was Ben Malasela. We admired him not only because of his academic achievement, but because he was not intimidated by Reverend Harris. Even the white faculty behaved in a servile manner to Reverend Harris, but Mr. Malasela would walk into the Reverend's office without fear, and sometimes would even fail to remove his hat. He met the Reverend on equal terms, disagreeing with him where others simply assented. Though I respected Reverend Harris, I admired the fact that Mr. Malasela would not be cowed by him. In those days, a black man with a BA was expected to scrape before a white man with a grade school education. No matter how high a black man advanced, he was still considered inferior to the lowest white man. Reverend Harris ran Clarkberry with an iron hand and an abiding sense of fairness. Clarkberry functioned more like a military school than a teacher training college. The slightest infractions were swiftly punished. In assemblies, Reverend Harris always wore a forbidding expression and was not given to levity of any kind. When he walked into a room, members of the staff, including white principals of the training and secondary schools, together with the black principal of the industrial school, rose to their feet. Among students, he was feared more than loved. But in the garden, I saw a different Reverend Harris. Working in Reverend Harris's garden had a double benefit. It planted in me a lifelong love of gardening and growing vegetables, and it helped me get to know the Reverend and his family. The first white family with whom I had ever been on intimate terms. In that way, I saw that Reverend Harris had a public face and a private manner that were quite different from one another. Behind the Reverend's mask of severity was a gentle, broad-minded individual who believed fervently in the importance of educating young African men. Often, I found him lost in thought in his garden. I did not disturb him and rarely talked to him, but as an example of a man unselfishly devoted to a good cause, Reverend Harris was an important model for me. His wife was as talkative as he was taciturn. She was a lovely woman and she would often come into the garden to chat with me. I cannot for the life of me remember what we talked about, but I can still taste the delicious warm scones that she brought out to me in the afternoons. After my slow and undistinguished start, I managed to get the hang of things, and accelerated my program, completing the junior certificate in 2 years instead of the usual 3. I developed the reputation of having a fine memory, but in fact, I was simply a diligent worker. When I left Clarkberry, I lost track of Mathona. She was a day scholar, and her parents did not have the means to send her for further education. She was an extraordinarily clever and gifted person, whose potential was limited because of her family's meager resources. This was an all too typical South African story. It was not lack of ability that limited my people, but lack of opportunity. My time at Clarkberry broadened my horizons, yet I would not say that I was an entirely open-minded, unprejudiced young man when I left. I had met students from all over the Transkei, as well as a few from Johannesburg and Basutoland, as Lesotho was then known, some of whom were sophisticated and cosmopolitan in ways that made me feel provincial. Though I emulated them, I never thought it possible for a boy from the countryside to rival them in their worldliness. Yet I did not envy them. Even as I left Clarkberry, I was still, at heart, a Thembu, and I was proud to think and act like one. My roots were my destiny, and I believed that I would become a counselor to the Thembu king, as my guardian wanted. My horizons did not extend beyond Thembuland, and I believed that to be a Thembu was the most enviable thing in the world. In 1937, when I was 19, I joined justice at Healdtown, the Wesleyan College in Fort Beaufort, about 175 miles southwest of Umtata. In the 19th century, Fort Beaufort was one of a number of British outposts during the so-called frontier wars, in which a steady encroachment of white settlers systematically dispossessed the various Xhosa tribes of their land. Over a century of conflict, many Xhosa warriors achieved fame for their bravery, men like Makhanda, Sindile, and Maoma, the last two of whom were imprisoned on Robben Island by the British authorities, where they died. By the time of my arrival at Healdtown, there were few signs of the battles of the previous century, except the main one. Fort Beaufort was a white town where once only the Xhosa lived and farmed. Located at the end of a winding road overlooking a verdant valley, Healdtown was far more beautiful and impressive than Clarkberry. It was, at the time, the largest African school below the equator, with more than 1,000 students, both male and female. Its graceful ivy-covered colonial buildings and tree-shaded courtyards gave it the feeling of a privileged academic oasis, which is precisely what it was. Like Clarkberry, Healdtown was a mission school of the Methodist Church, and provided a Christian and liberal arts education based on an English model. The principal of Healdtown was Dr. Arthur Wellington, a stout and stuffy Englishman who boasted of his connection to the Duke of Wellington. At the outset of Assembly's drive, Wellington would walk on stage and say, in his deep bass voice, "I am the descendant of the great Duke of Wellington. Aristocrat, statesman, and general, who crushed the Frenchman Napoleon at Waterloo and thereby saved civilization for Europe, and for you, the natives." At this, we would all enthusiastically applaud, each of us profoundly grateful that a descendant of the great Duke of Wellington would take the trouble to educate natives such as ourselves. The educated Englishman was our model. What we aspired to be were black Englishmen, as we were sometimes derisively called. We were taught, and believed, that the best ideas were English ideas, the best government was English government, and the best men were Englishmen. Healdtown life was rigorous. First bell was at 6 a.m. We were in the dining hall by 6:40 for a breakfast of dry bread and hot sugar water, watched over by a Soma portrait of George VI, the King of England. Those who could afford butter on their bread bought it and stored it in the kitchen. I ate dry toast. At 8 we assembled in the courtyard outside of our dormitory for observation, standing at attention as the girls arrived from separate dormitories. We remained in class until 12:45, and then had a lunch of samp, sour milk and beans, seldom meat. We then studied until 5 p.m. followed by an hour's break for exercise and dinner, and then study hall from 7 until 9. Lights were out at 9:30. Helltown attracted students from all over the country, as well as from the protectorates of Basutoland, Swaziland, and Bechuanaland. Though it was a mostly Xhosa institution, there were also students from different tribes. After school and on weekends, students from the same tribe kept together. Even the members of various Xhosa tribes would gravitate together, such as Amampondo with Amampondo, and so on. I adhered to this same pattern, but it was at Helltown that I made my first Sotho-speaking friend, Zachariah Mollett. I remember feeling quite bold at having a friend who was not a Xhosa. Our zoology teacher, Frank Lebentlal, was also Sotho-speaking and was very popular among the students. Personable and approachable, Frank was not much older than we and mixed freely with students. He even played on the college's first soccer team, where he was a star performer. But what most amazed us about him was his marriage to a Xhosa girl from Umtata. Marriages between tribes were then extremely unusual. Until then, I had never known of anyone who married outside his tribe. We had been taught that such unions were taboo. But seeing Frank and his wife began to undermine my parochialism and loosen the hold of the tribalism that still imprisoned me, I began to sense my identity as an African, not just a Thembu or even a Xhosa. Our dormitory had 40 beds in it, 20 on either side of a central passageway. The housemaster was the delightful Reverend S. Mokataimi, who later became the first African president of the Methodist Church of South Africa. Reverend Mokataimi, who was also Sotho-speaking, was much admired among students as a modern and enlightened fellow who understood our complaints. Reverend Mokataimi impressed us for another reason. He stood up to Dr. Wellington. One evening, a quarrel broke out between two prefects on the main thoroughfare of the college. Prefects were responsible for preventing disputes, not provoking them. Reverend Mokataimi was called in to make peace. Dr. Wellington, returning from town, suddenly appeared in the midst of this commotion, and his arrival shook us considerably. It was as if a god had descended to solve some humble problem. Dr. Wellington pulled himself to a great height and demanded to know what was going on. Reverend Mokataimi, the top of whose head did not even reach Drive Wellington's shoulders, said very respectfully, "Drive Wellington, everything is under control and I will report to you tomorrow." Undeterred, Drive Wellington said with some irritation, "No, I want to know what is the matter right now." Reverend Mokataimi stood his ground. "Drive Wellington, I am the housemaster and I have told you that I will report to you tomorrow, and that is what I will do." We were stunned. We had never seen anyone, much less a black man, stand up to Dr. Wellington, and we waited for an explosion. But Drive Wellington simply said, "Very well," and left. I realized then that Dr. Wellington was less than a god and Reverend Mokataimi more than a lackey, and that a black man did not have to defer automatically to a white, however senior he was. Reverend Mokataimi sought to introduce reforms to the college. We all supported his efforts to improve the diet and the treatment of students, including his suggestion that students be responsible for disciplining themselves. But one change worried us, especially students from the countryside. This was Reverend Mokataimi's innovation of having male and female students dine together in hall at Sunday lunch. I was very much against this for the simple reason that I was still inept with knife and fork, and I did not want to embarrass myself in front of these sharp-eyed girls. But Reverend Mokataimi went ahead and organized the meals, and every Sunday, I left the hall hungry and depressed. I did, however, enjoy myself on the playing fields. The quality of sports at Helltown was far superior to Clarkberry. In my first year, I was not skilled enough to make any of the teams. But during my second year, my friend Lok Enzamela, Helltown's champion hurdler, encouraged me to take up a new sport, long-distance running. I was tall and lanky, which Locke said was the ideal build for a long-distance runner. With a few hints from him, I began training. I enjoyed the discipline and solitariness of long-distance running, which allowed me to escape from the hurly-burly of school life. At the same time, I also took up a sport that I seemed less suited for, and that was boxing. I trained in a desultory way, and only years later, when I had put on a few more pounds, did I begin to box in earnest. During my second year at Helltown, I was appointed a prefect by Reverend Mokotimi and Dr. Wellington. Prefects have different responsibilities, and the newest prefects have the least desirable chores. In the beginning, I supervised a group of students who worked as window cleaners during our manual work time in the afternoon, and led them to different buildings each day. I soon graduated to the next level of responsibility, which was night duty. I have never had a problem in staying up through the night, but during one such night I was put in a moral quandary that has remained in my memory. We did not have toilets in the dormitory, but there was an outhouse about 100 feet behind the residence. On rainy evenings, when a student woke up in the middle of the night, no one wanted to trudge through the grass and mud to the outhouse. Instead, students would stand on the veranda and urinate into the bushes. This practice, however, was strictly against regulations, and one job of the prefect was to take down the names of students who indulged in it. One night, I was on duty when it was pouring rain, and I caught quite a few students, perhaps 15 or so, relieving themselves from the veranda. Toward dawn, I saw a chap come out, look both ways, and stand at one end of the veranda to urinate. I made my way over to him and announced that he had been caught, whereupon he turned around and I realized that he was a prefect. I was in a predicament. In law and philosophy, one asks, quis custodiet ipsos custodes? Who will guard the guardians themselves? If the prefect does not obey the rules, how can the students be expected to obey? In effect, the prefect was above the law because he was the law, and one prefect was not supposed to report another. But I did not think it fair to avoid reporting the prefect and mark down the 15 others, so I simply tore up my list and charged no one. In my final year at Helltown, an event occurred that for me was like a comet streaking across the night sky. Toward the end of the year, we were informed that the great Xhosa poet Kroon Makhai was going to visit the school. Makhai was actually an imbongi, a praise singer, a kind of oral historian who marks contemporary events and history with poetry that is of special meaning to his people. The day of his visit was declared a holiday by the school authorities. On the appointed morning, the entire school, including staff members both black and white, gathered in the dining hall, which was where we held school assemblies. There was a stage at one end of the hall and on it a door that led to Dr. Wellington's house. The door itself was nothing special, but we thought of it as Dr. Wellington's door, for no one ever walked through it except Drive Wellington himself. Suddenly, the door opened and out walked not Drive Wellington, but a black man dressed in a leopard skin kaross and matching hat, who was carrying a spear in either hand. Dr. Wellington followed a moment later, but the sight of a black man in tribal dress coming through that door was electrifying. It is hard to explain the impact it had on us. It seemed to turn the universe upside down. As Makhai sat on the stage next to Dr. Wellington, we were barely able to contain our excitement. But when Makhai rose to speak, I confess to being disappointed. I had formed a picture of him in my mind, and in my youthful imagination, I expected a Xhosa hero like Makhai to be tall, fierce, and intelligent looking. But he was not terribly distinguished and, except for his clothing, seemed entirely ordinary. When he spoke in Xhosa, he did so slowly and haltingly, frequently pausing to search for the right word and then stumbling over it when he found it. At one point, he raised his assegai into the air for emphasis and accidentally hit the curtain wire above him, which made a sharp noise and caused the curtain to sway. The poet looked at the point of his spear and then the curtain wire and, deep in thought, walked back and forth across the stage. After a minute, he stopped walking, faced us, and, newly energized, exclaimed that this incident, the assegai striking the wire, symbolized the clash between the culture of Africa and that of Europe. His voice rose and he said, "The assegai stands for what is glorious and true. In African history, it is a symbol of the African as warrior and the African as artist. This metal wire," he said, pointing above, "is an example of Western manufacturing, which is skillful but cold, clever but soulless. What I am talking about," he continued, "is not a piece of bone touching a piece of metal, or even the overlapping of one culture and another. What I am talking to you about is the brutal clash between what is indigenous and good, and what is foreign and bad. We cannot allow these foreigners who do not care for our culture to take over our nation. I predict that one day, the forces of African society will achieve a momentous victory over the interloper. For too long, we have succumbed to the false gods of the white man. But we will emerge and cast off these foreign notions." I could hardly believe my ears. His boldness in speaking of such delicate matters in the presence of Dr. Wellington and other whites seemed utterly astonishing to us. Yet at the same time, it aroused and motivated us, and began to alter my perception of men like Dr. Wellington, whom I had automatically considered my benefactor. Mackay then began to recite his well-known poem in which he apportions the stars in the heavens to the various nations of the world. I had never before heard it. Roving the stage and gesturing with his assegai toward the sky, he said that to the people of Europe, the French, the Germans, the English, "I give you the Milky Way, the largest constellation, for you are a strange people, full of greed and envy, who quarrel over plenty." He allocated certain stars to the Asian nations, and to North and South America. He then discussed Africa and separated the continent into different nations, giving specific constellations to different tribes. He had been dancing about the stage, waving his spear, modulating his voice, and now, suddenly he became still, and lowered his voice. "Now, come you, O house of Xhosa," he said, and slowly began to lower himself so that he was on one knee. "I give unto you the most important and transcendent star, the morning star, for you are a proud and powerful people. It is the star for counting the years of manhood." When he spoke this last word, he dropped his head to his chest. We rose to our feet, clapping and cheering. I did not want ever to stop applauding. I felt such intense pride at that point, not as an African, but as a Xhosa. I felt like one of the chosen people. I was galvanized, but also confused by Mackay's performance. He had moved from a more nationalistic, all-encompassing theme of African unity to a more parochial one addressed to the Xhosa people, of whom he was one. As my time at Helltown was coming to an end, I had many new and sometimes conflicting ideas floating in my head. I was beginning to see that Africans of all tribes had much in common, yet here was the great Mackay praising the Xhosa above all. I saw that an African might stand his ground with a white man, yet I was still eagerly seeking benefits from whites, which often required subservience. In a sense, Mackay's shift in focus was a mirror of my own mind because I went back and forth between pride in myself as a Xhosa and a feeling of kinship with other Africans. But as I left Helltown at the end of the year, I saw myself as a Xhosa first, and an African second.